Hello and welcome to more history stuff. So today I want to talk about an anniversary. On this day in 1356, Edward Balliol formally renounced his claim to be King of Scots to Edward III of England in exchange for a pension of £2,000 a year. And after making this resignation, Edward settled in England and spent the remainder of his life there, dying in 1364, about 8 years later, at the very advanced age of 81, a very old man for the time. So what was this all about, and who was Edward Balliol? Well, he was the son and heir of John Balliol, remembered in Scotland as Toom Tabard, or the Empty Coat, after his very ineffective time as King of Scots in the late 13th century, between 1292 and 1296, before he was formally deposed by Edward I of England, Longshanks, and basically ended up living in exile in France and died there in 1314, many years later. Ironically, that was the year of the Battle of Bannockburn, when Robert the Bruce, King Robert I, famously defeated the English and Edward II. Now, it should be remembered that this whole conflict that we remember as the Scottish Wars of Independence, while they were certainly a war of resistance against the English and the Plantagenet kings from Edward I onwards, it was also very much a civil war in Scotland and a conflict between the factions who were vying for possession of the crown, of the Kingship of the Scots, after the untimely death of Alexander III in 1286. And the main two factions, there were a great many claimants, but the two most powerful, the two most important, were the Bruces and the Balliols, and it was the Bruces who eventually won out. But the Balliols didn't give up, and after John Balliol died in exile on his estates in Picardy in northern France in 1314, he left his son Edward Balliol, who had inherited his father's claim to the throne and very much wanted to revive it. He had to wait a long time because after Bannockburn, the Bruce Scots, the Bruce faction, was very much in the ascendant, and Robert I, the victor of Bannockburn, had power very sort of tightly gripped in his hand, and he wasn't for letting it go. And he was obviously a very successful military commander, repeatedly defeated the English, and this war resulted in the Treaty of Northampton in 1328, whereby the English were pretty much obliged to concede independence to the Scots. And the treaty was basically an admission that the English or Plantagenet attempt to conquer Scotland had failed, and it was a recognition of the Bruce monarchy, the Bruce kingship. So this was as much a defeat for the Balliol faction as it was for the English, for the Plantagenets, and also for those Scottish nobles who had refused to accept Robert the Bruce as King of Scots and had been driven out as a result. These men were known as the Disinherited, and in subsequent years, after 1328, they would join forces with Edward Balliol and the young King of England, Edward III, grandson of Longshanks, who would all form a coalition and attempt to put Edward Balliol on the throne of Scotland. By this point, Robert I, Robert the Bruce, was dead, and he had left an infant heir, a young, very young son to succeed him, David II. And David's minority meant that Scotland was once again potentially vulnerable to conquest. And so after 1329, these various factions start to gear up for another attempt at conquering Scotland, basically tearing up the Treaty of Northampton. That's very soon blown to the winds, as these treaties tended to be in the medieval era. Once they had expended their usefulness, they were torn up and thrown away. So Edward Balliol wanted to become King of Scots, which he regarded as his right, inherited from his father John. And in fairness, it must be said that technically the Balliols did have the strongest claim after the death of Alexander III. It was stronger than the Bruce claim. The Bruces had a perfectly respectable claim to the throne, a bloodline claim, but it wasn't quite as strong as the Balliols. But by the time you get to about 1329, all of this is kind of secondary to the political reality. Whatever might be said about the Bruces, whether they were usurpers or not, I mean, Robert the Bruce had been very ruthless in the way he had seized power in Scotland. The fact was that they had won the argument, they had won the war, certainly in military terms. And in terms of hard political realities, the Bruces had won, and the Bruce kingship looked like it was there to stay. And it was up to Edward Balliol and his supporters, backed by the King of England, the young Edward III, to prize them out, to kick them off the throne by force, by military means. And that was not going to be easy, because the Bruce Scots had been in the ascendant for over 20 years now. They had employed very effective tactics, adopted guerrilla-style tactics to defeat the English. The English always had the numbers, the superior resources in terms of money and manpower, but that didn't always count for much, especially in a land like Scotland, where the country was very difficult, the terrain was very difficult in places, and the Bruce Scots had adopted this very effective guerrilla style of warfare. But then they'd also perfected battlefield tactics at Bannockburn famously, but also in battles like Old Byland a few years later. They had decisively defeated the English. And funnily enough, the English actually started to adopt Scottish-style tactics. They came to realise that they needed to adapt. And from about 1320 onwards, they start adopting Scottish-style infantry tactics and abandoning the old sort of cavalry base, mounted knight tactics that had served them pretty well so far and were the standard across medieval Europe. This all starts to change. And the Scots, as well as the Flemings, are one of the peoples who start to adapt and change the style of warfare, military tactics of the time. So this is not going to be easy for Balliol and the Disinherited, even though they have the covert support. Covert at this stage, Edward III doesn't openly come out in support of them, but he's certainly giving them sort of secret support. He's supplying them with some soldiers, a bit of money. And in 1332, Edward Balliol launches his bid for the Scottish throne. And he's initially very successful. He and the Disinherited win a battle at a place called Duplin Moor, where the Bruce Scots suffer their worst defeat for decades, and it's largely due to the use of the English longbow, or the war bow as it was called at the time. The longbow had yet to come to prominence, and Duplin Moor is probably the first battle where it's really used effectively, and it's a terrible shock for the Bruce Scots, who, while they had been able to use superior tactics against the English and their allies in the previous 20 years, suddenly the tables had turned and they found themselves facing this new kind of super weapon, the war bow, whereby English archers, well, English and Welsh archers, of course, could have about 14 arrows in the air per minute. A skilled longbowman could shoot that quickly, and at a great range, of course. And the arrows were capable of penetrating armour from a certain distance. And at Duplin Moor, the army of the Bruce Scots is just blown away really by this by the longbow, by this newfangled weapon. And for a time it looks as though Edward Balliol is going to succeed. He is crowned King of Scots. But he never enjoys much support in Scotland, because by this point, apart from the Disinherited, apart from the exiled noblemen who support him, the majority of the Scots don't really want the Balliol faction back again. They've got sort of used to the Bruce kingship, mainly because of Robert the Bruce's military success, which counts for more than anything really, especially in this era. And within a few months of Duplin Moor, Edward Balliol is ambushed. The Bruce Scots regroup, they rally, and they launch an attack on Balliol, and they force him to flee. Apparently in his nightshirt, he's taken very much by surprise. And he has to go scuttling back to England and get more support from Edward III, who at this point decides to just go for broke. He stops pretending that he's not giving the Balliols any open support. He comes out openly in favour of Balliol, and together they launch a combined invasion of Scotland in 1333, and this results in the Battle of Halidon Hill, which is another disaster for the Bruce Scots. Once again, they have to face the longbow and an English army, or an Anglo-Scots army, this time led by Edward III in person. And this is the first, or one of the first great victories that Edward III would win. Over the course of the next 30 years, the English would suddenly become very successful in military terms, especially in France. But they try out this new tactic of dismounted, sort of combined arms tactic of dismounted men-at-arms defending a fortified position, flanked by longbows. And at Halidon Hill, you see this in action really for the first time. The Scottish pikemen advance slowly uphill, straight into the face of this sort of wall of longbow, of this sort of arrow storm. They're shot to pieces, and by the time the survivors, exhausted survivors, reach the top, they're just cut to pieces by the English men-at-arms, who have done nothing but stand and watch. And the result is another great victory for the English and for the disinherited and Edward Balliol, who is now once again able to proclaim himself King of Scots. But despite this shattering defeat and the appalling casualties suffered, the Bruce Scots rally again. And Edward Balliol's big problem is he just cannot whip up or command enough support in Scotland. And the Bruce Scots are once again able to rally. And within a year or so, he's driven out yet again. And this means that Edward III has to prop him up again and pump more English resources, more money, more manpower into this Scottish war, which is once again starting to look like, as it did in the latter years of Edward I and during the reign of Edward II. It's this sort of grinding, this meat grinder of a war that doesn't seem to have any end. It just goes on and on and on, and it doesn't matter how many battles you fight, how many victories you win, it will just go on and on with no clear resolution. And by this point, Edward III is becoming far more interested in France. He's not as single-minded in his desire to conquer Scotland as his grandfather Longshanks was. He's far more interested in conquering or reconquering what he sees as his French inheritance, the old Angevin Empire. And from about 1335 onwards, he really starts to sort of lose interest in constantly pumping money and resources into this endless war in Scotland and supporting Edward Balliol. Now the two, he doesn't give up completely. There are further invasions of Scotland, but by this point the Bruce Scots have resorted to their old strategy of guerrilla warfare and avoiding battle. And while Edward III and Edward Balliol are able to sort of ravage southern Scotland, burn and pillage and sort of bring fire and sword to the country, they can't really impose any sort of political settlement or permanent conquest, because as soon as they withdraw through lack of money and supplies, the Bruce Scots just come back again and take back all that territory. And this kind of wasting war can't go on forever, especially with the English king, Edward III, now fighting a war on two fronts. And he's far more interested in France. And this leaves Edward Balliol stuck out on a limb, and the disinherited. They're kind of struggling to retain King Edward's interest. And over time, Edward Balliol is just forced to give up on his ambitions to become King of Scots. He cannot persuade Edward III to keep propping him up, keep supporting him, because it's not really cost effective for the English. It's just a mess all over again. And Edward III, as most of us will know, he is very successful for a long period of time in France. His armies win the battles of Crécy and Poitiers, as well as great victories at sea against the French and their Castilian allies. And Edward III was a bit of a glory hunter. He was far more interested in sort of winning these great chivalric massacres on the continent than he was in being permanently bogged down in a war in Scotland. And so by the time you get to 1356, Edward Balliol is now a very old man. He didn't have any sons, so there was nobody to sort of pass this baton on to. He does make one more attempt to get into Scotland and claim a part of Galloway in the southwest. But even there, that's the traditional homelands of his dynasty. His father, John Balliol, had been lord of a great chunk of Galloway. But even there, where the Balliol sort of sympathies and loyalties had always been strongest, by this point there's not much interest. And all of the local dynasties who had once supported the Balliols, they'd either been defeated by the Bruce Kings and accepted the Bruce Kingship, or they'd chosen exile. They'd just given up and gone and resettled in England. So Balliol can't do much there either. And in the end, he's old, he's exhausted, and he just surrenders the whole thing, accepts a pension, quite a generous pension from Edward III, and decides to resettle in northern England at Wheatley, Doncaster, and spends his last years there, probably quite comfortably. He's quite well off. A disappointed and a disillusioned man, of course, but not an uncomfortable one. Quite affluent, quite wealthy. And he lives to a very advanced age for the time, as I said, 81. Dies there peacefully in 1364. And that's pretty much the end of the long quest of the Balliols to achieve the kingship of the Scots. Almost sort of 70, 80 years, a great chunk of time. And it's one of those what could have beens. What if the Balliol family had managed to establish themselves and for any length of time and defeat the Bruces? What would the political situation and the relationship between the kingdoms of England and Scotland have looked like from that point on? But obviously we shall never know. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed that. Like and subscribe if you liked that. Don't if you didn't. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.